So, it's my great pleasure today to be speaking with Anders Åslund, who has a long and varied career as an academic, diplomat and author. Dr. Åslund has advised the Russian and Ukrainian governments and is author of 15 books, most notably Russia's Crony Capitalism, a scathing analysis of the economic system that has taken hold in Russia. He is a senior fellow at the Stockholm World Conference and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. He has been a professor at the Stockholm School of Economics and was the founding director of the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics. He's worked as a Swedish diplomat in Moscow, Poland, Geneva and Kuwait. Dr. Åslund earned his doctorate from the University of Oxford and he is fluent in 6 languages. I apologise if I've left out any of your other extraordinary achievements. So Silicon Curtain is a YouTube channel and podcast that has been set up to examine all aspects of propaganda, digital disinformation and hybrid digital warfare. So we will try to address some of these aspects of the dual crises that are currently unfolding in Ukraine and Russia today. So I'd like to start with current events. It seems that Ukraine has achieved a stunning initial victory in defending Kyiv. But this is just one battle, not the whole war. How badly must Putin fail to drag him kicking and screaming to the negotiating table? And can we even expect a sensible compromise to come from Putin? Is this in his nature?
I don't think that compromise is in the nature of Putin, so I think that we can leave that out. He's going for all or nothing. And the Ukrainian victory, as you said, has been quite extraordinary. And I suspect that we later will look upon this as 2 battles, one of Kyiv that the Ukrainians just have won, and the second to come over the Donbass. And my guess is that the Ukrainians will win that also. And in that case, the Ukrainians will have won the war. So now the Russian troops, if they have any sense, which is not obvious, they would withdraw largely from Kyiv and northern Ukraine. That's the cities of Sumy and Kharkiv primarily, and move them towards Donbass and say that the whole war was over the Donbass, which actually Putin said from the beginning. And then it's the question how that battle goes. And it's quite interesting why the Ukrainians have done so well. I think that the current Ukrainian meme that says slaves cannot defeat free men summarizes the whole situation. The Russians don't want to fight, and the Ukrainians want to defend their nation. So the Ukrainian nation has come to be a full nation more than ever during this war. 98% of the Ukrainians now, in a recent poll, defined Russia as their enemy, and 93% of the Ukrainians think that they will win the war.
And what do you think is the best historical analogy for what's happening now and the immense changes that Russia will undergo? Is it the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, the Russo-Finnish War, both massive military disasters, or might we see something on the scale of 1917?
Good points. A friend of mine suggested that when the war started, there were 3 alternatives. One, that this was Germany attacking Poland in 1939. The second, Stalin in the war with Finland, 1939-40. And the third, indeed, the Japanese War, 1904-1905. We already know that it's not Hitler's war on Poland. And the question now is whether it's the Winter War or whether it's the Russia-Japanese War. I think it looks like the Russia-Japanese War. And the outcome of that war was the revolution of 1905, which essentially finished off the Tsar's rule in Russia and the whole Russian empire. So what I would expect, if I just guess, is that Russia will lose the battle of the Donbass. Then it will make no sense for the soldiers to continue, so that they will rush home or away wherever they can, looting and killing and raping along the way, as the Russian soldiers did in 1917 when they mutinied from the front. And the Ukrainians will pursue them to protect their land. And Russia will meanwhile face a massive military loss. And at the same time, because of Western sanctions, probably see a decline in GDP of 20% or so. No regime is likely to survive such a double whammy. So I would presume that Putin would fall in one way or the other. The natural solution would be that it's the top that takes him out. But what Russian opposition analysts say today is that Putin is so well protected by the presidential guard, the federal security service, so that he cannot be taken out by anybody at the top. And then the opposition say that it will probably be collapse from the bottom up. So this might be a very messy affair.
So with these sanctions, do you think the economy in Russia, is that going back to the 1990s, or is it worse than that? I believe we were both in Russia at the time, and that was pretty bad after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Are they heading back to those days now?
Yeah, I think that Russia is heading towards 1989, 1990. Before the reforms started, the ruble is no longer convertible. Everything is being regulated very fast. Renationalization has been going on for many years. And now I think it will happen much faster, because what will happen with all these foreign companies that are now effectively abandoned by the foreign owners? Well, the state is likely to take them under administration in one way or the other. And Putin has already said that he intends to nationalize companies that have been abandoned. But the big blow to the economy will be the sudden absence of inputs. Russia can no longer produce tanks or cars because they all need semiconductors, which are all imported. And this is true of a large part of the production that will then just stop. And when the US imposed full sanctions on Venezuela in 2019, Venezuela's GDP officially fell by 35% in 1 year. I think that this would not be impossible in Russia, given that it's so vulnerable and all of a sudden has become subject to such severe sanctions. But 15-20% decline would be reasonable, and I can't see that any regime would survive that. In 1998, Russia saw a big financial crash, but GDP only fell by 5%. And President Yeltsin sacked the government 6 days after the financial crash.
So, given the situation, it's been claimed that Putin doesn't even know how to use a computer and doesn't use the internet. So what is the quality of information that he's getting from the yes men that surround him? Isn't he in the ultimate echo chamber, a kind of Kremlin bubble at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's how he likes to operate. An acquaintance of mine was in charge of the Prime Minister Chancellery when Putin became Prime Minister in 1999. And he told me how Putin immediately when he came in abolished all the alternative stovepipes that went straight up to the Prime Minister. That were traditionally the case, 3 or 4 of them, depending on the topic. For example, from the Minister for Foreign Affairs and from the foreign intelligence service and from the military going all the way up to the prime minister. Putin abolished it and put 4 KGB generals in the place and said, you choose the information that I need. And we've also seen the journalist Ben Judah described how Putin each noon when he has woken up, he gets 3 files. One is the file of the FSO, that is the Presidential Guard, telling about what is happening in the court. Second is from the FSB, the Federal Security Service, that tells him what is happening in the country. And the third comes from SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, what tells him what happens abroad. Note that none of these concern the economy. Putin doesn't bother about the economy, so that's not up there.
No, it's a military regime to an extent, isn't it? Which perhaps needs to be demilitarized itself. Now, there also seems to be a craving in the media, especially the Western media, and amongst politicians, to create an off-ramp for Putin, to allow him a kind of token victory. How dangerous is that? Are European politicians still seeking to appease Putin and to find some kind of messy compromise out of this crisis?
Indeed, you mentioned 3 words that I don't like, off-ramp and compromise. Well, de-escalation is also a word that is there. We should not try to compromise with Putin. He doesn't want to have any compromise. And this is a war. And this is an all-out war. The Ukrainians don't want any compromise. They want to kick out the Russians from the whole of Ukraine, including Donbass. And possibly they could discuss Crimea for later. But I don't really think so. And if Putin gets some kind of a compromise, then he will just regroup and attack later on. The Ukrainians want security for good, and the people are suggesting some kind of a compromise or appeasement. They seem not to understand that.
So what happens if this war doesn't end cleanly? What if we end up with a kind of hot peace or a cold war at the end of it? Wouldn't a North Korea scenario be an absolute disaster for Ukrainian statehood and may actually block the reconstruction and transformation of Ukraine into a modern state integrated into Europe?
I don't think so. I think that the North Korea scenario is a danger for Russia, not for Ukraine. And I think that the Russian soldiers who don't want to fight, that they will run away sooner or later. And also the quality of the soldiers is very low. The Ukrainians have killed 7 out of 20 Russian generals, commanding generals in Ukraine, and at least twice as many commanding colonels. So this is quite an extraordinary account, which shows that the Russian soldiers don't protect their superiors. One of these colonels was killed by his subordinate soldiers after they have lost half the troops in that battalion. So the Russian troops look very bad indeed. And I think, therefore, that the war is not likely to last very long. Because in order to have a long-lasting war, you need to have soldiers on both sides that have the motivation. The Ukrainian soldiers have massive motivation. The last number I heard is that there are 420,000 Ukrainian men who have returned to Ukraine to fight. And they are going into this meat grinder voluntarily because they want to stand up for their nation. So Ukraine has an extraordinary national renewal. And when you read the Ukrainian internet, you get quite surprised how secure they are in themselves. So the Ukrainians will not give up. And of course, for Ukraine, it will be a massive issue of reconstruction. And it's then important that the West comes in strongly in order to provide financial resources, but also governance in order to get Ukraine onto the right track, as Poland in 1989, so that it doesn't get into indifference as was Ukraine in 91.
So this is an interesting point, isn't it? That the last few weeks has destroyed the mystique of Russia's army. It's undercut all that hype about the strength and impact of Putin's 20 years of reforms and investments. Now the army looks more like a Potemkin village army, not the second best army in the world. How do you explain the calamitous performance of the Russian army? What role does endemic corruption play, the rigid vertical hierarchical system, and what role the lack of a clear strategy and leadership?
Indeed, Russia's problem is authoritarian kleptocracy, and it's also the problem of the army. Authoritarian in the sense that Putin doesn't listen to real advice, and nobody dares to give him negative feedback. Probably hasn't learned how many Russian soldiers who have died in the field as yet, because nobody would be silly enough to provide him with that information. And he does not want alternative lines of information, but only one line of information. As far as we know, Putin has in all probability planned this war only with one of his personal advisors, Yuri Kovalchuk, a corrupt businessman from St. Petersburg, and the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, and the Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov. So probably only 4 people have planned this. It's quite striking that nobody from the intelligence services seems to have even been involved. So it appears as if nobody knew how strong nationalism was in Ukraine, which would otherwise be pretty elementary. And Putin has, since his big article on the 12th of July, denied that Ukraine is a state and claimed that it has no right to exist. So the whole conceptualization was wrong. And then it's striking how the command system seems not to have worked. There's no clear commander of the military action in Ukraine. It appears to be run from the general staff, but then to a number of different generals in Ukraine who quite obviously don't coordinate their activities, nor do the different arms of the military coordinate with one another. So it's a big mess. For example, Western observers are very surprised that the Russians didn't bomb all the relevant airports and air defenses from the beginning. Ukraine still has an air force that has not been bombed, and they use it to a limited extent. And then everything in the army seems to have gone wrong very much because of corruption. So, for example, Putin has put his so-called chef, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's been sanctioned everywhere in the West because of his involvement in private mercenary companies, to have monopoly on supply of food to the military. And there have been frequent complaints about his poor food supplies before. It's also had a monopoly on the food supplies to the schools in Moscow. And some of the food rations have expired in 2015. And of course, there are no checks and balances on a good friend of Putin. He has put a number of his old friends, Sergei Chemezov, a KGB friend of Putin from Dresden in the 1980s, as head of a giant military industrial company, Rostec, which is failing to produce all kinds of modern arms, although it has 500,000 employees. Somebody, I don't know who, has replaced good tires on the military trucks with cheap Chinese tires that break all the time. And then the Russian soldiers consider it a human right to steal half a diesel in their vehicles, as a consequence of which the tanks, convoys repeatedly have stopped on the road. And then the Ukrainians say the Russian soldiers can't fight and they don't want to fight. So instead of fighting with us, they kill civilians. And the only thing that really functions on the Russian side is terror bombing of civilians and of all kinds of civilian facilities. So this is an utter disaster, and we should not have been surprised that it's so poor. Also, for example, they're using 4 different generations of tanks together, so that they can't use parts from one tank for another tank because they are completely different models. And the dominant tank is the old Soviet T-72 tank, 50 years old. So it seems that there has been no real modernization, only a few new arms that are being used for a show rather than for warfare.
So those they did shop a lot of new equipment, including a new tank, didn't they? But is that more for the sort of Red Square parades than a military reality?
Indeed, this Armata tank has not been used at all in Ukraine, and it's being used by the Tamadan Guard division outside of Moscow, which has 12,000 elite troops. But perhaps they are better on marching than on actually fighting, or perhaps Putin thinks that it's safer to keep such a division at home if there would be some attempt at a coup in Moscow.
This is in stark contrast to the performance of the Ukrainian army and the people. Can you describe to me the principal differences between the political and economic development of Russia and Ukraine? Are there deeper social political reasons why the Ukrainian army is achieving success and the Russian army is getting smashed?
The basic thing is that the Russian soldiers don't want to fight, and they are essentially slaves, while the Ukrainians want to fight, and they are free men. But when you also have the political organization, Ukraine has in the recent years carried out a far-reaching decentralization. So what you see now time and time again, it is the official Ukrainians are speaking are the mayors. The mayors are elected, and in elections in late 2020, most of them were re-elected because they had made the mark for local development. So you have local leaders with authority in Ukraine, and therefore each town manages to fight for itself. And in 2014, when the Russians attacked in the east, what salvaged Ukraine then was the volunteer battalions. So therefore there's a strong volunteer tradition now in Ukraine. You can say that it really took off in 2004 during the Orange Revolution and developed during Euromaidan, and in particular in the war in Donbass in 2014. So for example, in Mariupol, it's one of the volunteer battalions, the Azov battalion, that is still holding the city after 5 weeks of massive bombing. And apparently they still have 1,500 men fighting in Mariupol, so the Russians can't take Mariupol. So this is quite impressive. Then you have tactics also that the Ukrainians lost a lot of men in the Ilovaisk battle was in September 2014, and something like 800 men who were simply captured and shot down by the Russians. and they don't want to see that again. So and they were also afraid that they would be bombed from above, because they knew that the Russians would have air dominance from the outset. So therefore, the Ukrainians distributed their forces, they have spread out, and they are therefore not very sensitive to bombing from above, while the population are. So the Russians mainly kill civilians and not soldiers. And another thing is that the Ukrainians have got good training from the British, the Americans, and the Canadians in Western Ukraine around Lviv. So, for example, the British claims to have trained 22,000 Ukrainians, so that they know how to do warfare. And to a considerable extent, the Ukrainian troops do guerrilla warfare, while the Russians do tank warfare. And tank warfare, you can say, is old-style warfare. Fortunately, the Ukrainians have got a lot of good Western equipment quite late in the day, but I'm happy to say that my own country, Sweden, has delivered 10,000 anti-tank weapons. And of course, the UK and the US have delivered far more. So the anti-tank weapon and Stingers are doing wonder. What is missing is high altitude air defense, which the Ukrainians think they would like, and they would also want to have possibilities of taking out the Russian bases in Russia from which they are being attacked. Why are the Russians allowed to bomb in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are not supposed to attack these bases from which they are attacked both with missiles and airplanes? And then something that is difficult to understand, it's intelligence. The Ukrainians clearly know where the Russians are and what should be done to them, while the Russians don't seem to know a thing. They seem to move almost without intelligence. So there are many reasons why the Ukrainians are doing much better than the Russians. And of course, that the Russians are pursuing a war as if it's World War II. They are coming in long tank convoys, and the Ukrainians go up close, take out a few tanks, and take out a few commanding officers, and the tank convoy doesn't know what to do, and is essentially broken. So the Ukrainians claim now that they have taken out 600 Russian tanks, 130 helicopters, 130 airplanes, and more than 17,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. So Ukraine is a real meat grinder for the Russian army.
It recreated Stalingrad in the 21st century, it seems. Another unforeseen consequence seems to be relating to Sweden, which you mentioned, and of course Finland, where I believe the tide of popular opinion has gone in favour of joining NATO. That's a fairly major change, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. And it seems that Finland is now ready to join NATO and is likely to do so at the NATO summit in June. In Sweden, the four non-socialist parties are clearly in favor of joining NATO, while the Social Democrats that hold the government are not ready as yet. I think that they will swiftly turn around in the early summer, and that Sweden will join NATO together with Finland.
Now, I get a lot of people, even now, making the argument that somehow it's NATO that has triggered this invasion, that somehow NATO is guilty for this, rather than maybe the reverse, which is the appeasement, indifference and complacency of the West over the last 20 years, when perhaps it was clear very early on that Putin was becoming an autocrat. What's your view on what the real triggers for this invasion were?
Yeah, I think that the real trigger, as I have in my book, Russia's Crony Capitalism, that Putin wants make himself popular and to increase his repression at home on the basis of war. So his war in Georgia in August 2008 led to his great popularity of 88% at that time. His war in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea in March of 2014 led to another 88% popularity. And now I saw that Putin's popularity, according to the Levada Center, which might not be very independent any longer, has gone up to 83%. And Putin has really moved repression in Russia back to Stalin times. This is no longer Brezhnev repression. This is far worse.
I did hear Viktor Shenderovich talking about that, and he said that you're less free in Moscow now to express your opinion than you were in Brezhnev time or under Chernenko, where obviously I wasn't alive then, but obviously Viktor Shenderovich was and experienced it. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. And what was always the case in the Soviet Union after Stalin, that was that you had a private sphere where Russians talked freely among themselves in a low voice in the kitchen. Now they don't any longer, because many people are simply brainwashed by the awful Russian television, so that often parents and children have completely different conceptions of reality, where the parents who watch Russian television tend to believe things that the children know are not true.
Now, propaganda doesn't work in a vacuum, does it? It needs something to put its roots down into. And with Russia, it seems there is a rich soil of historical myths, imperialistic fantasies that allow this crude propaganda to work.
Well, I don't know. Tucker Carlson on Fox News is the most well-paid person on television here in the US, and he spreads exactly the Putin myths and supports Russia in full in Ukraine. So it seems to be more a matter of modern media, that modern television can convince people to go like that. On the other hand, it seems that the internet is changing this, so that people are not being so easily taken in by the myths that television is so good at spreading.
So that's an interesting question. So obviously a lot of people in the media again say, well, there's all this propaganda in Russia, people aren't getting accurate information. Now, let's take a scenario. What if they were suddenly to get perfect information? On that theory, Russians would take to the streets, they would protest, and they would all be against the war. I'm not sure that is true, because if you take 6th of January coup, you can access that information, but I believe something like 30% of the US actively are rejecting democracy and are fairly okay with what happened in the 6th of January. I imagine it's similar in Russia. There will be a proportion of the population who will be absolutely fine with what's happening, even if they were to learn the truth.
Yeah, the general sense in Russia is that there is a massive polarization of society. Before the recent events, the sense was that 1/3 were true liberals, 1/3 were really anti-democratic, and 1/3 were pretty indifferent to politics. Probably now the indifferent share of the population has declined, but various opinion polls suggest that it's 50-60% of the people who are on the anti-democratic side. But what we have seen after the war in Georgia and the war in Ukraine in 2014 is that the enthusiasm for imperialism has declined pretty fast. And given what is likely to happen, a massive military loss in Ukraine, whatever comes out, and a big decline in the Russian economy, that will probably have a big impact when people realize what is going on.
So, of course, Putin's obsessed with a sort of 19th century disease of taking land by force, making physical conquest, but clearly he's losing that 21st century war for mind and talent as well. And it seems he's actually sacrificed this digital economy for these imperial dreams. I heard a figure the other day that about 18,000 programmers have fled the country, and now scientists are being fired from their jobs for, expressing vague discontent at the war. What do you think's going on here? What war does he think he's fighting?
Well, Putin has shown since 2012 that he couldn't care less about modernization and economic development, economic growth. These are not his agendas. His agenda has been macroeconomic stability, which he had protected quite well before, but now completely blown up, and then power. So macroeconomic stability and power. But now when he has lost economic growth, macroeconomic stability, is also likely to lose power. With regard to immigration, I think it's much more, say, 300,000 well-educated young Russians that has left since the war started.
And to an extent, Eastern Europeans have been telling the West for years about this threat, not just from Russia as a whole, but specifically from Putin. Do you think they've been ignored?
Yes, I think that what we are seeing now is that the politicians, in particular the three small Baltic states and in Poland, they have understood this all along. In particular, the politicians in Germany and France have been spectacularly wrong. I would say that the South Europeans have not been much engaged. The North Europeans have largely been on the side of the East Europeans. I should mention Romania also as a very sensible in these regards.
Now, I know you have been observing Russia for a long time, and there are some pivotal moments, for instance, when Khodorkovsky was obviously arrested and imprisoned, and he was clearly trying to introduce some kind of Western standards of compliance and so on. Bill Browder was forced out of the country. At what point do you think the oligarchs went from being sort of proto-capitalists and then turned into parasites, the kind of people we see around Putin and whose ridiculous yachts are being, impounded around the world?
Well, I would say that the oligarchs could be divided into four different groups. One is Putin's cronies, four of them, who have made the money simply on Putin, for Putin and with Putin. Then you have four of the most famous oligarchs who have been frontmen for Putin, solving various problems for him, but they are, to begin with, real businessmen. Roman Abramovich, Alisher Osmanov, Oleg Deripaska, and Suleiman Kerimov. So these are people who have been completely opportunistic all the time and continue to be so. Then you have 10 top state enterprise managers who have been appointed by Putin, often because they come from the KGB or because they worked for Putin in other positions, who are completely useless as businessmen and are destroying big state companies. And then you have all the others, so, say 80 billionaires who have made the money on their own as tough businessmen. You have to be tough in order to succeed in the Russian environment. They have concentrated ownership because corporate governance doesn't function. Then you need to have concentrated ownership to be able to manage a company. And they are in companies with big economies of scale, like steel and coal and oil and gas, and then you need the big companies to succeed. So therefore, these people are very wealthy, but they have made the money originally in a sensible fashion. After Putin has come to power, he has demanded ever more obedience from the big businessmen. If they are not sufficiently obedient, as for example Khodorkovsky or Vladimir Gosinsk or Boris Berezovsky or Durov, etc., then they have to leave the country, and their property is taken away from them and taken over by the state or given to one of Putin's good friends. So oligarchs are really very different people. So some of the oligarchs who have their yachts impounded are rather petty, but of course they have not been paying taxes, but that is because Putin has made it possible for them not to pay taxes, and they have to pay tribute to Putin. We see that in the Panama Papers. For example, one of these oligarchs, Suleiman Karimov, paid $235 million to Putin's childhood friend, the cellist Sergei Roldukin, for services. What services does a cellist do for $235 million? So this is a straightforward tribute.
Now, to an extent, is it true to say that Putin's created something like a feudal state? There isn't rule of law, there isn't recourse to independent courts, none of those exist anymore. There's no local government, he's completely destroyed any independence of the governors. And that's what people tend to focus on, but also on an individual level. Isn't it true to say that he's created a society where artists, singers, actors, the entire middle class practically are dependent on state institutions and state companies for their money? In effect, isn't it almost like he has reversed, the emancipation of the serfs, and he's basically turned Russia into one massive dependent and compliant population? And if you're not subservient, you suffer or have to leave.
Yeah, indeed. I call it a neo-feudal state, and we can also see that all the sons of Putin's friends are getting top jobs at the age of 30, 35. They become vice presidents in the big state banks on no merits whatsoever. Typically, they are educated in St. Petersburg or Moscow. If they are educated abroad, they are not welcome home, because Putin does not want people with foreign education. They can stay abroad if they have done so. So you can say that the real oligarchs, they educate their children abroad and they stay abroad. So they leave the Russian political scene after that. While Putin, Siloviki, the security officers, their children, their sons are educated in Russia and become top officials. For example, the Minister of Agriculture today, Dmitry Patrushev, is the son of the National Security Vice Nikolai Patrushev, who's one of Putin's old friends from the KGB in St. Petersburg. And before he became Minister of Agriculture, he ran the Russian Agricultural Bank, a big state bank, into the ground. So if you have managed to fail in one job, you should, of course, be given another big job that you can run down. Another, Sergei Ivanov, Putin's former chief of staff, his son, also Sergei Ivanov, is now head of the state company, Al-Rosa, state diamond company. So in this way it functions. The sons are taking over a top job, and the people who get angry then are the opportunistic new elite who wants to get to these positions, and they see that there is a glass ceiling for them because they don't have fathers in the right group. No women, no daughters are given these jobs. It's only for the sons.
And you've written a lot about the transitions from communist economies over the last 20 years. Isn't it now clear that market economy and autocracy are just not compatible? At some point, the selfish and possibly even absurd strategic aims of the autocrat will destroy any incremental economic and social progress that has accumulated.
Indeed, it's the same all over the world. The only autocratic state that can claim any quality of governance over a long period is Singapore. And in due time, I presume that we will see that that only depended on one exclusive man, Lee Kuan Yew. So going back to Russia, in the fall of 91, the three things that Yeltsin did not do, which should have been done, is first of all, he should have dissolved the parliament in October, November 91, when it was politically possible, and called for new elections and get a democratic parliament. That is what needs to be done next time around. The second thing is he divided and cut down the old KGB, but Putin has restored it and built it up again. It has to be abolished, altogether abolished. And the third thing is that no rule of law was being established, no proper judicial reform. And then people complain, but why didn't the reformers do it? The answer is simply, virtually all the reformers were economists. They didn't know much about politics, and they knew very little about law. So because the lawyers were not reformists, there were many lawyers around, but they were basically statists and conservative, and there were hardly any political scientists of significance around.
And taking that thought forward to the current generation of activists, the liberal intelligentsia who surround the various people there. Most of them obviously pushed out of the country now. There's only, I think, Ilya Yashin and a few others who are still in the country. I mean, what hope do they have of getting near power? And actually, isn't there a risk as well that they've spent all their time perfecting how to oppose, how to create almost sort of like oppositional PR? None of them have actually governed or managed a country. What do you think the hopes are of a transition to a liberal economy?
Well, I think it's pretty good because there are so many eminent Russians abroad now, millions of them. And what typically happens when you have a real regime change is that a lot of immigrants come back. We've seen that in the Baltic countries and also in, I think, most East European countries. But there have been people who have been abroad for a long time who have come back and they've acquired the relevant skills and the relevant honesty in order to do a proper job. So I think that Russia is in a far better situation now, but we have to expect that that will be the case. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it turned out that the old dissidents, they were absolutists. If anything was the slightest wrong, it was absolutely wrong. So therefore, they were quite impossible in management positions because they were not prepared to any compromise, because their lesson was that you cannot compromise with a regime. Then all your principles are lost, which made sense in the old communist world, but it was not very relevant when you moved to a more modern world. So the obvious only alternative politician today in Russia is Alexei Navalny. He has 7.6 million followers on subscribers on YouTube today. So when the regime breaks down, if Navalny is still alive, he will be liberated in a way as you can say that the real perestroika started, or democratization, when Gorbachev allowed Andrei Sakharov to come back from exile in Gorky. And while Sakharov died in 1989 and therefore did not become a leader, he was a very important leader before that, for the year before his death. So I think that we should compare the role of Navalny today with the role of Sakharov. And Sakharov was quite realistic.
And that takes me on, I think, probably to, I know we're running out of time, it takes me on to the last question, really, and it does relate to Sakharov, because I believe the year before the Soviet Union was dissolved in that famous event when Yeltsin sort of stood up and pointed at Gorbachev, I believe Sakharov had floated the idea of breaking up the Russian Empire, of actually creating a sort of federal state and forming almost like a commonwealth of the ex-Soviet states. That didn't happen, obviously, and Yeltsin was able to grab power off the back of the collapse of the Soviet Union. What is the next stage? I know various commentators are actually talking about Russia itself fragmenting and breaking apart. And in some way, does that need to happen in order for Russia to evolve its political system and to become a more egalitarian society?
Somebody drew my attention to my old boss, Yegor Gaidar's book, Collapse of Empire, from 2006. And he actually pushes that thesis, that if any Russian leader in the future, clearly thinking of Putin, will try to re-establish the Russian Empire, that will almost inevitably lead to the breakup of Russia itself. I was quite struck that he had drawn the thought so far. And I think that it's a general view that Chechnya should not stay in Russia. Chechnya today is an Islamic republic, a complete dictatorship. It has nothing to do with democracy. It would have to go. And then there are certain other areas that might not want to stay. Dagestan is a big question beside Chechnya. Ingushetia on the other side of Chechnya is another question mark. Tatarstan on the Volga is a fourth question mark. So it would be natural that certain parts of Russia disappear when Putin's regime collapses because of his war in Ukraine. I have no strong views of it, but these are common views that are being discussed among Russians.
And it sounds to me like your view is that this is going to happen sooner rather than later. And overall, it sounds like you've got a fairly optimistic outlook. The war is going to be won in Ukraine's favor, and that seismic change is coming to Russia, hopefully for the better. I mean, how would you sort of summarize your views on what happens next?
Yeah, I agree. Ukraine is likely to win the war in Ukraine. Russia is likely to suffer an enormous military defeat. Russia will now see a massive economic decline. I think that these two effects will take out Putin in one way or the other. And I think that will lead to the collapse of the system in Russia. And that in turn will lead to a democratization in Russia. I don't believe on any hardliners in the wings. That is always the myth presented about Russia. And the West can and should engage in massive reconstruction of Ukraine, and also massive reconstruction of Russia to a democratic state, and do for these countries what was not done in 91. And that will also be true of a lot of other former Soviet republics that are now trying to keep a distance from Putin.
Mm-hmm. So we'll see Belarus collapse probably, and several other states that reliant on Putin will move on with their evolution.
Yeah, Belarus is probably the easiest state to reform of these.
Well, I'd like to say a huge thank you. It's been a tremendous pleasure speaking to you. I know there are huge demands on your time, especially at the moment. So I'm very grateful that you've taken an hour out to really discuss the crisis and give us an incredible inside view on what's happening.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.